This is My Dark Path. On Monday, May 24th, 2004, Albert Kite, a 53-year-old from Aurora, Colorado, failed to show up for work at Carter Douglas, an engineering consulting firm in nearby Denver. Al, as he was known among his friends and family, was not prone to lateness nor unexplained absences. So after multiple calls to his mobile and home went unanswered, his boss, concerned that something might be amiss, called his sister Barbara, who was his emergency contact. After Al failed to respond to her calls and then their brother's, she called the Denver police, requesting that they perform a welfare check. She lived across the country in Virginia and could not check on him herself. So later that afternoon, the police arrived at the 2-story townhouse in Aurora, a Denver suburb where Kite lived. They knocked on the door, and this elicited no response, and so they decided to enter the house, fearing that he might be in danger. And once inside, they quickly searched the first floor, but finding nothing out of place, they made their way upstairs. And again, they found nothing. Then they proceeded downstairs to the basement, and it was there, in the basement bedroom, that they found Kite's body. Al was lying face down, with blood spatter located along the wall and the floor around his body. The room where Al was found was a simple bedroom, ready for a tenant to move in. A box springs mattress rested on a metal bed frame. Brown carpet covered the floor, and the walls of the basement apartment were painted white. The police were shocked by the gruesome scene. Detective Thomas Sobreski of the Aurora Police Department responded to the call and later became a case investigator. He said that the crime scene was, quote, "the worst I'd ever seen," end quote. Al's hands were bound with a cord and his feet were then tied to his hands behind his back. He had, in essence, been hogtied. And among the wounds inflicted on Al was a blow to the back of his head. This would become important as the investigators recreated the crime scene. It indicated that he had been hit from behind, and it was likely the first strike against Al to incapacitate him. Al had then been mercilessly tortured for several hours. The killer had inflicted several wounds on the bottoms of his feet, and a knife had been inserted above his eyeballs and into his ears and shoulders. In all, the killer stabbed Al 22 times, and just as horribly, his head had almost been severed. The autopsy concluded that Al had died on May 22nd, 2 days before the police had discovered his body. But how and why did this happen to Al Kite? A quiet man, Al loved the outdoors, cared deeply for his work, and had many dear friends and family. So what had brought on this terrible torture and murder? Of course, any murder is unjustified, but the uncommonly gruesome killing and the unusual circumstances make the case extraordinary. These combine to make the theories about the murderer and his motives very disconcerting. The true crime genre can be titillating for many, allowing people to experience vicariously immorality and sorrow. But cases like this remind us that evil exists, and any one of us could fall victim at the most unsuspecting moment. Hi, I'm MF Thomas, and welcome to My Dark Path, where I explore the fringes of history, science, and the paranormal. So if you geek out over these subjects, you're among friends here at My Dark Path. I hope you'll check us out on X, YouTube, and Instagram. Sign up for our newsletter at mydarkpath.com. And I also want to thank our growing group of Patreon supporters. Finally, thanks for listening and choosing to walk the dark paths of the world with me. Let's follow one now and explore the lasting terror of the Al Kite murder in this 60th episode of My Dark Path. Part 1. So how had the killer gotten into the house? There were no signs of forced entry, after all. When the police had arrived at the behest of Al's sister in Virginia, Everything had looked normal from the outside of the home. Al's residence was a spacious two-story townhouse with ample room that he humorously claimed was more than necessary for a middle-aged bachelor with a penchant for the outdoors. In the early 2000s, Al had made a practical decision to convert the fully furnished basement into an apartment with a bathroom, bedroom, and living room. But the only way into and out of it was through the front door of the home. Now, previously, I had thought that the basement apartment was truly independent of Al's home. Instead, it was more like a wing of the property. Al would be interacting with anyone who rented the space, truly like a roommate. And I found photos of the home in the basement apartment that I'll share on mydarkpath.com. So, Al's transformation not only assisted in managing his mortgage payments, but also effectively utilized areas of the house he felt he didn't need. Now, a tenant had been renting the basement apartment for several years, but early in 2004, he had informed Al of his intention to vacate in the coming months and not renew his lease. So, following the tenant's departure in May of 2004, Al initiated the search for a new occupant. He placed some ads and attracted interest from many potential renters. And one man in particular seemed to be a good match, and he arrived on May 18th of 2004 to meet Al in person. Okie Albert Kite Jr. was born on May 7th, 1951 in rural Nash County, North Carolina, the son of Okie Albert Kite Sr., a distinguished dog trainer and entrepreneur, and his wife, Edith Davis Kite. The family also included an older daughter who we already met, Barbara. And the younger Oak later adopted the nickname Al, presumably to stand out from his father. The family was a nurturing environment. But tragically, Al's mother, Edith, passed away at just 48 years old. Al was just 18 at the time, and the loss was profound for the entire family. But nevertheless, Al found ways to thrive. His high school years at Weldon High School were notable for his friendship with a young woman named Gail Kay, and this was a bond that persisted after high school, despite that Al had to leave the area to attend college. Al attended the Atlantic Christian College in Wilson, North Carolina, just about an hour away from home, where he earned a degree in business administration. In 1971, with his degree in hand, Al got a job with Stone and Webster, a giant engineering firm. His first position was at the Surrey nuclear plant, about an hour and a half southeast of Richmond, Virginia. And after working in an entry-level timekeeper position, he was eventually promoted to be an accountant and then again to a position as a department head. And a few years after joining Stone and Webster, he married his high school friend Gail Kay in 1976. He also included Gail's young daughter Julie into their family. Al and his family then relocated with Stone and Webster to other sites including Massachusetts, Texas, New York, Nevada, Wyoming, and Tennessee. And he even worked overseas in Algeria in northern Africa. Al and Gail, though, ultimately divorced in 1988, but Al remained close to his stepdaughter. And after the divorce, Stone and Webster relocated Al again, this time to California, and there he worked on projects at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories, San Francisco International Airport, and the Bay Area Rapid Transit. In 1998, he was transferred to Colorado. This opportunity was exciting for Al as the location brought him closer to the outdoor activities he loved, such as golfing, biking, hiking, camping, and skiing, and he jumped at the opportunity for another move, unfortunately the one that would be his last. Al Kite moved to Aurora, Colorado, an area on the outskirts of Denver's metropolitan area, and there he bought a townhome on South Helena Street. The townhouse had 2 stories and a basement, providing the room that he needed. When I first heard about the case and its location, I spent a Saturday afternoon driving to his townhome and neighborhood. I found a parking place and then found the home. Just like when I found the Amityville horror house, I resisted the temptation to knock on the door and ask the current owners what they felt or knew about the case. And in both scenarios, the house is a home to a family and not an exhibit at a sideshow. And so I satisfied my interest simply by walking the neighborhood, trying to imagine how it would have felt to be one of Al's neighbors and to have been so close to such a horrible event, yet to be ignorant of it until the police arrived. And so while the date is uncertain, it was soon after he moved into the townhome that he decided to convert the basement into the apartment and rent it. And this extra income was no doubt helpful as he was laid off by Stone & Webster in 2002, but soon he found a new position with another engineering consulting firm. And Al's life changed in some dramatic ways in 2004. First, as I mentioned, that long-term tenant renting his basement apartment decided to move out, making it available for a new one in May. And second, he began dating a woman, Linda Angelopoulos, and soon the relationship became even more serious. And Al, preparing for May when the basement would be vacant, started advertising for that new tenant. Part 2. So sometime in May 2004, someone responded to Al's ad to rent his basement apartment, and the prospective renter introduced himself as Robert Cooper. He told Kite that he'd just moved from the East Coast and had taken a job with Wells Fargo in the Denver area. Now, as someone who manages my own rentals, I know the relief that Al must have felt as he talked with Cooper over the phone. Cooper certainly knew how to put a landlord at ease. He had a job with a big, stable company. He had local family in the area and needed to move into a new apartment quickly. These characteristics would signal stability and normalcy, just the qualities a landlord would want in a renter. And so, over the phone, they agreed to meet so that Cooper could tour the basement apartment. But while he was inspecting this new potential apartment, something happened that Cooper seemingly wanted to avoid. Kite's girlfriend, Linda, stopped by. Al thought it would be nice for her to meet this potential new tenant as he would be somewhat of a roommate. And as she stepped into the bathroom for a moment, Cooper came upstairs and quickly excused himself, leaving before she could even meet him. And Linda later commented, quote, "He did not want me to see him at all," end quote. Although she never met him face to face nor talked with him, she made some observations about him later. She said that he had dark, wavy hair, was well dressed, and was in his 40s. She also noted that he walked with a limp and used a cane. Perhaps unsurprisingly, she wasn't impressed with this potential renter and was happy to hear that he had told Al that he didn't want to rent the apartment as he left. But a couple of days later, Cooper contacted Al again and told him that in fact he did want the apartment and wanted to move in soon. So they agreed to meet on May 18th so that Cooper could give Al his rental application, a security deposit, and the first month's rent. In turn, Al gave Cooper a key. And just like that, within a day, Robert Cooper, the killer, had access. Now, there's some disagreement on the dates here. Several accounts describe their meeting as being on May 19th, while others say the 18th. Now, I also believe that the initial visit, the dissatisfying meeting with Linda, and the handover of the deposit and rent all occurred on this date. For all of those events to have taken place at the same time, well, that seemed unreasonable. So I found a reference that describes a more reasonable sequence of events. That Cooper did his first inspection on a date earlier than the 18th, and it was on that same day that he narrowly avoided talking with Linda. An article from 2019 said that Linda had her chance encounter with Cooper weeks before the 18th. But whenever that first meeting was and the tour occurred, Cooper did return on the 18th to pay Al and collect the key. This is much more reasonable, but I've reached out to confirm it to several people at the Aurora Police Department to try to get confirmation. But so far, I've had no return calls. But this timeline also makes more sense given another odd and very disturbing fact. At the same time Robert Cooper was interacting with Al in May, talking with him on the phone, touring the apartment, he was also interacting with other landlords in the area in the same way. Cooper was casing multiple apartments and landlords in the Denver area. Now, I can't find the exact number of other landlords that Cooper evaluated, but from the stories I'll share here, it would at least be 2 more in addition to Al. So, Just consider this. The man who called himself Robert Cooper was so invested in killing that he spent a considerable amount of time in the month of May 2004 selecting his victim. Now, I'm envisioning the moment a phone call occurred between a police officer and one of these landlords. Based on Cooper's cell phone, the police knew the landlords he'd called. I'll share more about that cell phone later. But the call from the police must have started as mildly interesting. Every response from a landlord probably started like this: "Sure, officer, a man, Robert Cooper, did call me about my rental and came by to see it, but ultimately he decided not to rent it from me." And then, either because the officer explained the purpose of the call or the landlord had heard of the vicious murder of Kite, the landlord would have had a sudden, rushing, horrible realization. Each had been under the gaze of a sadistic killer, and that something unknown had averted his gaze to another victim at seemingly the last moment. Now, years ago in 2017, I had somewhat of an analogous experience where my life was spared by chance. I'd just wrapped up a team dinner in London at a restaurant overlooking the Thames River. Some of the team had wanted to visit the nearby borough market, so everyone agreed to go. But the hour was somewhat late, and as we walked and we drew close to the market, we realized it had closed and was not worth visiting at the 10 p.m. hour. So the group broke up, some thinking they'd just walk in the area, but being very jet-lagged, I decided to take an Uber back to my hotel. And when my Uber pulled away just a block from the market, I still recall dozens of police cars and ambulances racing to the area. I didn't think any more of it at the time until I was back in my hotel room and saw the horror of the London Bridge attack. 3 terrorists had driven a van into pedestrians on the London Bridge before crashing the vehicle and proceeding on foot to the borough market. The dozens of police cars had been there responding to the attack in real time. There, those terrorists attacked people with knives before being confronted and shot dead by the police. 8 people were killed and dozens were injured. I'd been standing there across the street just minutes before my Uber had arrived. I don't want to make this into a dramatic event, but I still feel a chill when the memory returns, just how fate allowed me to avoid this experience that killed and injured so many. And perhaps this is how these landlords felt once the police called and asked them about this Robert Cooper, and then they realized how close they were to a life-ending event. So who did Cooper visit under the guise of finding a place to live? A nearby University of Colorado professor was also renting out an apartment, and Cooper had met her. Her description was surprising, especially when compared to the characteristics that Linda, Al's girlfriend, had observed. The professor noted that Cooper spoke with a Romanian accent, but did not walk with any sign of a limp or use a cane. So how did the professor know what a Romanian accent was? Perhaps most Americans might be able to identify a person who spoke with an Eastern European accent, but the ability to detect a specific accent like that seems unusual. But apparently, this professor was very familiar with these languages and knew how to distinguish between them. And as police found and interviewed others who had had Cooper visit them to tour their rentals, contradictory accounts emerged. Some landlords thought that Cooper was in his 30s, while others thought he was in his 50s. With some landlords, he presented with a limp and used a cane, but for others, he walked without a problem. And Cooper could also alternate between American and Romanian accents. Still, one element was consistent among all the landlords who interacted with him. Cooper always changed his speech, behavior, and movement with each landlord he visited. Another landlord, an older woman, reported being creeped out by the way that Robert Cooper had inspected her home. She told the police that he was very interested in the windows, inspecting many of them in the home exhaustively. The 2018 VICAP, or Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, summarized a description of Robert Cooper as the following: race, white, skin color, fair or very fair, sex, male, age unknown but between 30 and 50, height 5'10", weight 170 to 180, hair color brown or black, eye color brown or hazel, and distinguishing characteristics, possible Eastern European accent. So Cooper's actions of switching accents, faking a limp, changing his appearance seem to be forensic countermeasures designed to make it more difficult to discover his real identity, or at least delay the police's investigation. But why go through all the trouble of disguising himself just to meet with these landlords? A popular theory is that Cooper was seeking out a target and that Kite was simply a victim of circumstance. By introducing himself to the landlords as a possible renter, Cooper built up trust with them, and the ruse allowed him to enter the apartments without suspicion. And once he was in, he could determine which one of them was the most vulnerable. But I find it difficult to square this idea, at least among the other landlords we know about. Al, it seems, would not have been the most vulnerable person compared with some of the older females he met. Yet, as Al lived alone, this perhaps distinguished him as the most vulnerable victim. We don't know, and as the police are maintaining this as an active case, these details haven't been released. Still, I agree with the hypothesis that Cooper was randomly visiting properties to pick a victim for the following reason. Cooper, as we've seen, was very disciplined in planning and execution, including how he disguised his identity. And if Al had been his target victim, why would he expose himself to others around the city when he already knew who he wanted to kill? Additionally, Robert Cooper knew of his plan to kill someone no later than March when he purchased a burner phone in Denver. Had Al been his target in March, could he have known that Al would have been renting his apartment later that spring? But in the end, whatever the rationale of Cooper's deranged mind, he did choose Al Kite and murdered him brutally. Part 3. So I've tried to find a list of everyone who met with Robert Cooper during May, but found nothing definitive. And again, I've asked the Aurora Police Department for something, but since the murder is now 20 years old, I don't expect that there's anything new to be gained by trying to contact these witnesses. But I am interested in seeing the geographic dispersion of the homes or properties that Cooper visited. Were they concentrated in a specific area? And was Al's home in that area? Or was there another criteria used by the killer to select apartments to visit for rent? And what was the range of monthly rents of these visited properties? We know that Robert Cooper had no issue giving Al Kite over $700 for his deposit in the first month's rent. So he was certainly willing to invest to accomplish this crime. The other question that emerges as I think about the types of properties he visited relates to how Cooper moved around the city of Denver. If you've listened to episode 57 of My Dark Path, you know about the serial killer in the 1910s who is likely the Villisca axe murderer, and you'll know that the data that links over 50 murders to one killer comes partially from an analysis of the geographic locations of those crimes. And as I've learned over the last year or two, Denver is not a convenient city to move around in, even with a car. By the nature of Cooper's movements throughout the city to visit these different properties, it seems unlikely he was using public transportation, but that's just a hypothesis. When Al's body was found, police did canvass his neighborhood, and given the careful planning that Cooper deployed, it seems unlikely that he would have taken a bus to escape from the scene. So he must have left a car a short walk from Al's home. But investigators collected nothing useful about descriptions of unusual cars they saw parked in the neighborhood that weekend, so that too was another dead end. But a few other facts came to light later. When police investigated the crime scene, they found the rental application crumpled up in the garbage. It included the name Robert Cooper, his current address, his social security number, references, and a phone number. However, the address, supposedly his sister's in Denver, was a University of Colorado building. The social security number belonged to an elderly woman who lived in Indiana, and the reference phone number dialed a retirement village in Aurora. But his personal phone number on the application turned out to be that burner phone that he had purchased in March, 2 months before the killing. Cooper had bought it with cash from a convenience store in Denver and then waited over 30 days to activate and use it. Somehow he knew that 30 days was the period that the convenience store retained their security footage, denying police any way to see who purchased it. And Cooper kept the phone quarantined from any other part of his life. He only used the phone to contact potential landlords and victims. But the University of Colorado Medical School would return as a potential link in this case. First, the convenience store where the burner phone had been purchased was just off campus. Second, several of the vacant apartments visited by Cooper were only advertised in the medical school library. And third, the address on his renter's application was that of a university building. But all of this would come out later as evidence of an extraordinary level of discipline and planning. But first, the events of May 22nd need to be fully understood. Again, I find Cooper's evil discipline to be extraordinary and terrifying. The level of planning required stretched back months before that terrible day in May. And while he didn't know Al's name on the day he bought that burner phone, he must have known the horrors that he'd inflict on someone in the coming months. Part 4. So what happened on the morning of Saturday, May 22nd? Al was up early that morning, driving his girlfriend Linda to the airport so that she could start a week-long business trip. When he dropped her at the terminal, she said that she'd call when she landed, so they spoke twice that afternoon. At the time of the first call, he'd just completed some home repairs with a neighbor and was enjoying his Saturday. The second call, though, was about 3:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Later, Linda said the first call was normal, with Al happy and active, but the second call was odd. Al was unexpectedly terse with her, and that was the last time she or anyone knowingly spoke with or interacted with Al. What happened the rest of the day, the last day of his life, is conjecture based on evidence. Only the man who calls himself Robert Cooper knows for certain. Linda knew Kite had talked with Cooper about getting some help moving a recliner from his living room into the basement via those stairs. It's this fact that creates the hypothesis that during the move, Cooper had Al in a vulnerable position, allowing him to take Al by surprise. And this is thought to be the moment where Cooper delivered the blow to the back of Al's head that the autopsy identified later. After the surprise attack, Cooper moved Kite to the basement bedroom, where he was found by the police, and it was there Cooper bound and tortured Al for hours. And I don't think it's necessary to repeat the horrors that Robert Cooper inflicted on Al, other than to say the wounds were designed to prolong the torture and pain, and the near capitation, like the rest of the wounds, were excessively violent. The autopsy, as I said, determined that Al had died that afternoon on the 22nd. And with his evil act complete, Cooper started a rigorous effort to clean the crime scene. First, he filled a sink with bleach and then started loading it with everything that he had touched or used in the murder. The kitchen knives went in first. Cooper had used at least 6 of them, followed by the honing or knife sharpening rod that he'd used to brutalize Al's feet. He also dropped in a house key, a pen, and a drinking glass into the bleach. And then he proceeded to wipe down the house for fingerprints. After that, Cooper took a shower, wore several items of Al's clothing, ate some food, and slept in his bed. The fact that he took the time to do so indicates that Cooper knew no one would be in Kite's house for a while, further supporting the theory that Cooper chose his victim based on minimizing his risk of discovery. Given the very organized nature of the murder, sleeping in Kite's bed and wearing his clothes were not likely random events, but a part of his plan. It served no practical purpose, but it seems that doing so satisfied some sort of psychological need or fulfilled some sort of fantasy. What that fantasy or need was remains a mystery. But sometime during the night, Cooper took Al's GMC pickup truck and withdrew $1,000 from an ATM at a nearby Wells Fargo. Police eventually would find the ATM and look at the security camera footage, But Cooper, again, had been prepared. The photo shows him wearing a ski mask that only shows his eyes and nose. He'd also been wearing gloves while performing the withdrawal, leaving no fingerprints. And after visiting the ATM, Cooper had driven back to Al's townhouse, but instead of returning the truck to the garage, he left it parked a block and a half away. Inside, he left the ATM receipt. And then, upon entering the townhouse, he placed one last item in the sink of bleach, Al's car keys. Sunday morning, before he left Kite's house, he completed 2 more tasks. He took the trash with him and poured bleach down the drains. But he left 2 more clues as he disappeared: a small bloodstain on the basement stair wall and the rental application crumpled in the trash can that I mentioned earlier. These 2 clues would help police start to understand the crime, but ultimately leave them frustrated and without answers. Part 5. And now we return to the period where we opened the episode, the afternoon of Monday, May 24th. After finding Al's body and starting their search, the police started to form hypotheses. Their immediate observations drove the first one at the scene. To explain the almost unreal physical torture that the killer had inflicted, the police believed that the murder must have been a crime of passion. But soon this hypothesis had to be discarded. There was no one in Al's life who disliked him or could be counted as an enemy. Linda described Al's attitude towards people as, quote, "If somebody would have said, 'Give me all your money,' he'd ask why, but then he'd give it to you," end quote. And Al's sister said that he was, quote, "very compassionate. He had a goodness about him," end quote. And so police started to pursue their next hypothesis, that the murder was a robbery. They saw that the debit and credit cards were missing, and that afternoon they found his truck with the ATM receipt, and they also checked his credit cards and found that substantial activity had occurred after his time of death. Now, the police haven't released these details, so we can't surmise what they might tell us, but later the police would use the amount of the withdrawal as an indication that the murder was not a robbery. Al had much more than $1,000 in his bank account, and Cooper had ample time to take it all if he wanted it. And so robbery was also discarded as a hypothesis. Police soon realized that Al's cell phone was missing. Police started to trace his phone, and then, identifying Cooper's phone as well, started to track the location of both phones. And they were surprised to find that both of them were on the move in the Denver area. Excited, the police quickly started a search and found both phones, but neither were in possession of the killer. The phones have been dropped in the 5 Points area of Denver, where there's a consistent homeless population. The killer, like everything else he'd done, had planned ahead, knowing that transients would use the phones. And while detectives wrestled with the challenge of finding Al's murderer, his family and friends grappled with the anguish of losing Al. His body was held by the coroner for a week or so before being released to his family, and his earthly remains were transported to his birthplace, Halifax, North Carolina. And on June 2nd, 2004, a congregation gathered for a memorial service, and Al was laid to rest in the church cemetery. Now, unfortunately, Al's murder remains unsolved to this day, almost 20 years later as of this recording. And what evidence there was did little to identify the killer. A composite drawing was made of his likeness. To create the drawing, a police artist used reports from the landlords who'd interacted with Cooper, Al's neighbors who saw him at a distance, and the photo taken at the Wells Fargo ATM. The Aurora police distributed it, but nothing came of it. And as the facts of the case came together, law enforcement started to piece together a profile of his assailant, incorporating various leads and observations that, while speculative, became integral to the investigation. Here are the facts that they started with. The killer may have come from the East Coast and New Jersey in particular. The killer may have had a female relative in the area, like a mother or sister. The killer may have had some connection to Wells Fargo or banking in general. The killer may have had some association with the University of Colorado Hospital or medical school. And lastly, police theorize that the killer may have attempted to become a police officer due to his use of psychological diversions that he deployed after his crime. And while the police have maintained an appropriate level of secrecy with other facts in the case, it appears that none of these theories have helped find the killer. So, what of the other clue that Cooper left? Remember, the police had collected a blood sample from the wall of the stairwell going to the basement apartment. This DNA evidence was entered into the FBI's National DNA Index system, but no matches have ever been made. Still, with the advent of genealogy testing, the Aurora police and FBI have been constructing a family tree for the suspect. And this was the technique used to identify Joseph James DeAngelo, also known as the Golden State Killer. He was apprehended in 2018 through the use of genetic genealogy, where investigators used DNA from crime scenes linked to the Golden State Killer and compared it with the genetic profiles available on open-source genealogy websites. This process eventually led them to DeAngelo's distant relatives and then subsequently to him, with police finally confirming his identity through direct DNA comparison. The hope is that Robert Cooper might be identified through the same technique, yet, as of today, no progress has been shared with the public. But some evidence from the DNA sample has been released. In 2017, the Aurora Police Department hired a laboratory in Virginia to evaluate the DNA collected in that blood sample. The lab created a DNA-based composite sketch of the subject. This cutting-edge technique suggested that the perpetrator was a Caucasian male, aged between 40 and 50 years at the time of the crime, with genetic roots tracing back to southeastern Europe. The photos of this and the other things I've mentioned are at mydarkpath.com. So without any immediate leads and the DNA evidence coming up dry, 3 theories have emerged in recent years. The first hypothesis suggests a link between the murder and Al's professional background as a chief accountant and department head overseeing substantial engineering projects, including the nuclear plant in North Carolina and the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories in California, as well as that project he completed for Stone & Webster in Algeria. We'll call this the Al's job hypothesis. The second theory suggests the possibility that this act was a practice kill. In this scenario, the murderer was a contract assassin who needed to be tested via a real-world killing. And the third and perhaps most chilling scenario considers the possibility that this act was simply a random killing by an extraordinarily disciplined serial killer. In this scenario, a serial killer might have chosen Al as a target without any discernible motive, only to satisfy his bloodlust. I think it's worth considering each of these hypotheses, as each of them are supported by facts of other cases. What I find fascinating about all 3 hypotheses is there are well-documented examples that show each is imminently possible and aren't simply flights of fancy. And I'll explore these hypotheses and the facts behind them in a future episode. So it's hard to find the right words to say about the horrible loss of Al's life. And so I'll simply share a Dylan Thomas poem that he wrote in 1947 when his father was going blind. Given what we know of Al Kite and the way that he lived, perhaps he'd want us to contemplate the meaning of this poem as we live each day, not knowing the day nor time of our passing from this mortal life. Do not go gentle into that good night. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning they, do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright, their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight and learned too late they grieve it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death who see with blinding sight. Blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my Father, there, the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And with that, dear listeners, thank you for walking the dark paths of the world with me and finding light even in its darkest corners. I'm grateful for you and your support. Until next time, good night.